US President Barack Obama live from Beijing. Big news, the two countries announcing a new deal to try to cut greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, for some analysis of this, we're joined now by Dr. John Blaxland. He's a Senior Fellow at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. Dr. Blaxland, President Obama described his talks with China as historic. How do you view these agreements, particularly those cuts to greenhouse gas emissions?
Tony, thank you. Look, I think this is actually a very significant day. We've seen President Obama being essentially hamstrung by his electoral defeat in the midterm elections with Congress going Republican, and we're seeing him emerge, I think, as really playing to his strengths now, his oratory skills, his ability to engage on a personal level in this way at the leader-to-leader level, his ability to grapple with some of these issues in a non-confrontational, inclusive way. I think we're seeing President Obama, who's been dealt essentially a bale full of lemons, and he's making lemonade. This is a circumstance where the United States is essentially very much constrained because of the challenges elsewhere in the globe, with the crisis in Iraq and Syria, and challenges in Ukraine and other parts of Europe. And the US President really has had to make the most of this opportunity. And we've seen President Xi respond in kind.
Dr. Blaxland, President Obama says this climate deal is ambitious but achievable, and he hopes to encourage all major economies to be ambitious. Is he trying to also send a signal, given that he is coming after all to Australia in just a few days' time? Is that a signal to governments like Australia's?
Well, look, I think, if the United States and China are going to set this kind of agenda, it's going to be almost impossible for Australia not to follow. That's the bottom line. Australia is not big enough to rail against this. This is going to drive Australian change as well, I think. But there's a range of issues here that are really worth reflecting on. It's interesting, the emphasis on international security. We see an emphasis on cooperation in Afghanistan against the so-called Islamic State, on counter-terrorism. These are all really positive things. And interesting, the answer to the question about the pivot. He really tried to diffuse this issue of this being a confrontation between China and the United States. And that's because Obama recognises that putting this in terms of a confrontation is getting the United States nowhere at the moment. The United States is not in the position it was a decade ago, where China was economically weaker and the United States was much more dominant. The equation is much more about a balance in the Asia-Pacific. And so in recognising that, Obama has masterfully demonstrated just how you can play this in a way that is going to speak to a Chinese audience and hopefully speak to an international audience, while also getting some credit back in the United States, given the very hostile Congress he's about to face when that convenes.
Dr. Blaxland, if I can take you on to some other areas now, the military ties, is it just rhetoric, or will there be a deepening of military ties between China and the US?
Well, look, it's definitely problematic, but we've already seen through the Rim of the Pacific exercise, where the United States for the first time invited the People's Liberation Army Navy to participate in that activity. That was a pretty successful activity. It was a significant bridge building activity. We've seen Australia participate in this kind of activity in the recent trilateral exercise in the Northern Territory, the survival exercise with a handful of Chinese, American and Australian troops. So my sense is that this is really, it is definitely aspirational, but it is pointing in the right direction. It's looking to try and build momentum in a constructive way, and while not completely ignoring the challenging areas that remain, and the New York Times journalist picked on some of those in terms of the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the terminology of the pivot to Asia. He's really trying to look beyond the rub points and come up with something whereby China and the United States can collaboratively work things through. Now, part of the issue here is about respect, and I think Obama gets the fact that really face matters, and in trying to coax China to play more by the West's rules, by the global order we've come to know and love. He's really had to show a bit more deference and respect to win them over. He's hoping that that's worked, but certainly from what we heard from President Xi, that looks pretty positive.
I was going to ask you about that, Dr. Blaxland, because while President Obama says he wants to take US-China relations to a new level, at the same time, this APEC meeting, for example, has been happening in Beijing. China was showing off its sophisticated new stealth jet fighters, parading them at an air show in the south of the country.
Yeah, but I think we need to be not get too excited about this. The J-31, which is considered the Chinese quasi, counterpart to the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter, is broadly considered to be not in the same league. It might look a bit like it, but technologically it's not nearly there. Remember, it's not just how the platform looks, it's actually about the technology on board, it's about the engines, and we know, for instance, the Chinese are still reliant on Russian engines to power these aircraft, and so, well, yeah, okay, it looked good, but observers have been saying, look, the aircraft isn't able to pull the Gs that the F-35 can pull. It's not nearly as sophisticated, and this is about show. Obama gets that, Xi gets that. You play your bit. It's as William Shakespeare says, all the world's a stage. This is a stage-managed event, and as we know in China, stage-managed events really matter. Obama gets that, and I think he played that remarkably well in this set of circumstances.
You touched on face before, Dr. Blaxland, and it's so important in Chinese diplomacy. Has Barack Obama turned up in Beijing treating China more as an equal than a threat in the Pacific?
Well, I think that's right, and I think this reflects a bit of an internal tussle within the United States, within a kind of a hawkish bent in the foreign policy and defence policy world, and the dovish bent, and the one that is focused on economic opportunities. Certainly, the business side of the United States sees opportunity, sees challenge and opportunity. But the opportunities are so great, focusing on the hawkish dimensions of the equation are really have proven to really not get the United States very far in its bilateral relationship with China. Now, having said that, all of the countries around South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, all the ASEAN states have all been watching this very, very closely, intently listening to the words he's been uttering, both Xi and Obama. And they're watching to see what cues are there about how the United States is going to remain engaged in Asia, and whether a compromise and some kind of accommodation can be reached. It's very significant that Obama spoke about the rule of law in dispute settlement, and this is something that has been on the agenda for some time now, particularly for the countries of ASEAN, and they're all about to head to Naypyidaw to hold that meeting there to discuss this. But addressing the rub points in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, through established legal procedures and mechanisms, that's what we're all hoping will happen to avert potential calamity.
A final quick question, Dr. Blaxland. We know that both Barack Obama and Xi Jinping are about to come to Australia as well, and both leaders are touting major speeches. Barack Obama in Brisbane, Xi Jinping to address the federal parliament, of course. What's the sense of what their message will be when they're here on Australian soil?
Well, I think if we go from what we've heard today, the Abbott government is going to take heart that this is really a constructive way forward for both China and the United States' approach to engagement in the region. Now, clearly, both the United States and China have a vested interest in seeing Australia being more supportive to their actions than the others. This is the balancing act that Hugh White's talked about, that we in Australia have to try and reconcile and keep that creative tension in our minds between our dominant economic partner and our strategic and security partner, and hopefully come up with a resolution, a way forward that is actually going to keep both that tension creative and not destructive, and help find a way forward that will actually help Australia and actually maybe even help China and the United States a little bit as well.
Well, Dr. John Blaxland, we really appreciate your time this afternoon. Dr. John Blaxland from the Australian National University, thank you.
My pleasure.